So as a summary of this text so far, the Israelites have been in exile and have been overpowered at God's will by the king of the Babylonians, and their glorious temple where they worship God has been destroyed. 70 years later, God allows them to return from exile and they begin to rebuild the temple. Interestingly, they build the altar of the new temple before the temple itself, and then they build its foundations. People are full of praise and joy at merely the foundations. But some who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundations of the new temple being laid. So what are the questions that arise for you from this text? For me, there are three main questions. Why did they build the altar first? Why do they sing out in praise when they've only laid the foundations? And then lastly, why are some of them weeping instead of praising with joy? So let's take the first question. Why on earth did they build the altar first? Now, when people do things that we don't understand, it's really important that we get to know the journey that has led them up to this point. And namely, why did God send them into exile? And what does the altar event in Ezra 3 signify for them now? So let's take a look at the chronological map, which I found of the Bible, which is really useful. So we can see where we are in the fuller framework. And as you can see here by my red arrows, the book of Ezra comes directly after the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles, and these books describe the reign of King David in the history of the people of Israel. And 2 Chronicles also documents the reign of King Solomon and subsequent kings that succeeded him, the first being his son, Rehoboam. And as you can see later on the next slide, it was Solomon who built the first temple of Jerusalem. In this time, the planning and the construction of the temple that they worshipped God in is given great significance, for the temple symbolizes God's presence on earth. And just as King Solomon finished building the temple, God appeared to him and said this: "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. But if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands that I have given you, and you go off and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land, which I have given them, and I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name, and I will make it a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples." Now, after the death of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was divided into the northern and the southern kingdoms, and 2 Chronicles documents the reign of kings that succeeded him in Judah, with many people from the northern kingdom of Israel having settled there too. And whilst King Solomon was not without his own failings in terms of idolatry of other gods, most of his successors also unfortunately lead the people of Israel into worship of other gods, exactly what the God of Israel had asked them not to do. And you will see from my red, amber and green colour coding how successful each were in their devotion to God or not. Starting with Solomon's own son, King Rehoboam, he, and I quote, "did evil because he had not set his heart on seeking the Lord. He ignored the advice of elders, and he appointed his own priests for high places and for the goat and calf idols he had made." And high places were areas where they worshipped other gods. So things didn't start very well. And then after some battles for power, we come to King Asa, number 3 on the list, who, and I quote again, "did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord God, his God. He removed the foreign altars and high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles that were symbols of the goddess Asherah." In terms of his influence on the people of Israel, he commanded Judah to seek the Lord and to obey his laws and commands. He removed the high places and incense altars in every town in Judah, and the kingdom was at peace under him. And then similarly, King Jehoshaphat also bowed with his face to the ground to the God of Israel, and all the people of Judah and Jerusalem fell down in worship before the Lord, and the kingdom of Jehoshaphat was at peace, for his God had given him peace on every side. So from these 2 kings, we gain a wisdom lesson about leadership in that good people lead people to do good. When the kings focus on the God of Israel, so do their people. So why have I not coloured these two kings in green? They both, towards the end of their reigns, begin to trust in other kings, making treaties or forging alliances for their safety, rather than relying on God. So they didn't put God first, and this displeased God. Our second lesson in leadership comes from King Joash, number 8 on the list, who is also orange. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord during the time of Jehoiada the priest. He tried to repair the temple from previous break-ins and lootings. However, when Jehoiada the priest died, the officials of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and he listened to them instead. They abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and worshipped Asherah poles and idols again. And King Joash also ordered for the son of Jehoiada, who was sent to prophesy to him, to give warnings about God's anger, and he sent him to be stoned to death. Eventually, God strengthened enemy armies who came against King Joash, and he was severely wounded. Then his own officials conspired against him for killing the son of the priest, and they killed him in his bed. So lesson 2 in leadership and leading a life of faith is keep accountable. For as soon as he lost his accountability buddy in the priest, it all began to fall down around him. We need people around us to be answerable to and to keep us on track in our journeys of faith. And we find our third lesson in the story of King Uzziah, number 10 on the list, who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He sought God. But after he became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God, and he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. In the temple there were 2 altars, one that was accessible by all people, and one in a closed-off section called the Holy of Holies, where only ordained priests who were of a particular line of descendants could burn incense. And this is where King Uzziah had wrongly entered. So the priests got rightly angry, but Uzziah just got angry back at them. And whilst he was doing so, standing in front of the incense altar of the Lord's temple, a skin disease, likely leprosy, broke out on his forehead. It's quite a grisly book if you read the full detail. So the priests hurried him out of the temple because he was unclean and he had leprosy until the day he died. So lesson number 3, pride comes before a fall. Then we have all the kings in red, who, for example, rebuilt altars to other gods within the temple of the God of Israel, sacrificing their own sons to other gods, practicing sorcery, divination, witchcraft, and consulting mediums and spiritists. And we see them leading the people of God astray as they became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations and defiling the temple of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. The kings in green, you'll notice there's only 2, did aim to make right from wrong and destroyed the previous altars to foreign gods that the other kings had built and re-established a covenant, i.e. a promise, with the God of Israel. And because of this, God turned his anger away and didn't punish the Israelites. But we nevertheless have this pattern of toing and froing of the devotion to the God of Israel and the idolatry of other gods. But eventually, by the time we get to Zedekiah, the last in the list, God's patience runs out. And God brings up against his own people the king of the Babylonians, who broke down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all of the palaces, captured the people of Israel as servants, and looted the temple of all its treasures and set fire to it. The Israelites then spent 70 years in exile, and we find ourselves here in the book of Ezra, the Israelites having now returned to Jerusalem and are now focused on rebuilding the temple, the one that was destroyed in God's anger all those years before. So this is the journey that we need to understand that has led the people of Israel to this point in Ezra 3. Many wrongdoings in terms of idolizing other gods, turning back to God again when a king leads them to do so most of the time, but then going back and doing the same things wrong time and time again. I wonder if we relate to this in our own lives. And so to bring this back to our first question, why did the Israelites build the altar first when they were rebuilding the temple? We need to remind ourselves of the significance of various sections of the temple. The temple's design overall was built to symbolically reflect the design of the heavens and the earth, and the valuable stones which adorned both the temple and the priest's clothes were meant to symbolize the starry heavens. The Holy of Holies, a curtained-off section just on the left of that plan, housed the presence of God itself, and the only way the high priest could enter his presence would be to offer incense, which formed a cloud so thick that he could not see God's glorious appearance, because it would have been too much for him. And the altar, just outside of the Holy of Holies, was where sin was dealt with and where offerings were made and where the everyday man met with God. When I first moved into where I live now, I looked at the kitchen. The first thing I wanted to do was to rip out this very brown hooded oven. It was the first room I was going to tackle. I wanted a brand new kitchen. And I spoke to the builder and he said, E, he knows me by E, you've got some leaking windows that you need to sort out first. You've got some pointing on the outside wall that needs sorting out, and your electrics are shot. And so my nice kitchen was going further and further down this very expensive list. You see, I wanted this new temple of a kitchen. I wanted it to look wonderful with all the bells and whistles and the shiny stars. But everything had to be done on the inner structure. First things first, everything in its right order. The Israelites therefore built the altar first because they understood its spiritual significance. It was a wise spiritual priority, showing that they understood their need to have atonement from sin, i.e. to reconcile with God again and perform acts of dedication to God. Having served their exile, they are symbolically putting God first again, the very thing that they failed to do time and time again in the historical account of 2 Chronicles. The people now understood that nothing makes sense unless at the heart of everything is the worship of God, the God who has brought them out of exile. Before they rebuild the temple, they are rebuilding and restoring their relationship with God. First things first, everything in its right order. Which leads us into answering our second question. Later, why do they sing out in praise at having finished merely the foundations? Since the destruction of the temple under the Babylonian conquest, there had been no proper place for sacrifice and worship for the people of Israel. So they now worshipped at the first opportunity, not waiting till everything was right and finished. It was a joyous occasion. Worship had been restored. And secondly, they'd taken pleasure in small things. If you had had everything taken away from you, would you not accept small mercies and blessings with even greater joy, a new perspective? It was great to hear examples of us taking joy in and thanking God for small things towards the beginning of this service. And on our return from COVID, weren't we grateful for in-person services, even with smaller numbers? And how about refugees, not just from Ukraine, but all over the world and throughout history? I'm sure they are immensely grateful for small things. It is important to see the beauty in small things and to not despise the day of new beginnings. And thirdly, reconciliation. Have you ever done things that you wish you hadn't done time and time again? The same mistake repeated. The Israelites repeated the same sins under different kings. I imagine they are now grateful to be reconciled with God, having come out of exile. The greater the distance you travel away from God, the deeper your praise and desire for a relationship will be on return. It is time for reconciliation, and they are playing their part. So they sing out in praise at merely the foundations of the new temple. Which brings us on to answer the third question. Why are some of them weeping instead of praising with joy? On the screen shortly, you will see a picture of one of my favourite spots of Bedgebury Forest just down the A21. On the left is a picture of this spot during May, and on the right is a picture of the same spot just from a slightly different angle in the month of November. And you can tell a stark difference between the seasons here. And a friend of mine came to the forest with me recently as she specifically asked to go to see this same spot as shown on the left in May due to the beautiful azaleas that were in full bloom that I'd kept talking about. We walked a 1.5-hour route to get there, which I'd planned deliberately so we'd finish in this area of beautiful flowers like a grand conclusion. But when we got there, all of the flowers had either gone or were dull and wilted due to the heavy rainfall in the days before. And as we looked at this unexpected scene, we stood in the disappointment of the present. I kept telling my friend what had been literally like only 4 days before to try and lift her spirits. I kept showing her the photo reel on my phone to prove how magnificent it had been. I even put my phone up so she could see the before and after matching scenes. But it could only show her a memory of what it had been before, and it served only to increase our disappointment. Comparison is often the thief of joy. And this is why some of the people wept and cried in this text at seeing the foundations of the new temple. They had seen the magnificence of the temple in King Solomon's time and were grieving what had been before. The older men knew that this temple would never match up to the glory of the first, given the investment spent on the first building temple. Isn't it strange, though, that they are weeping at the foundations of the new temple, which they are comparing to the finished form of the previous temple? They seem to have a fixed idea that when the new temple is built, it just won't be the same. Perhaps on returning from lockdown, we felt this way about church as it is now, compared with how we remember it from pre-COVID times. Had things changed? Were things done differently? Did we wish it was like it was before? Or maybe there are areas of our lives that we've had to change irreversibly due to changing circumstances. Whilst respect for the past is due, it is so easy to stay in the past in our minds, centering all our thought processes on what we have lost. Now, there is an important place for grief, and we need to be sensitive to that, and perhaps not be as hard on the weeping elders of the text as it might be tempting to be. But I'd like to challenge us all, when the time is right, to engage with a new perspective, whatever your circumstances. And are the elders perhaps stuck in the glory of the past? One commentator puts it this way: there was a danger in their weeping. The backward look which discounts present activity is always a peril. Regrets over the past which paralyze work in the present are always wrong. Moreover, all such regrets, as in this case, are in danger of blinding the eyes to the true value and significance of the present. On preparing for this sermon, I received the words great, great potential. And I wonder if, when looking to the past as a reference, we miss what God is doing in the present, that is, in fact, rebuilding our future. Fiona Tolhurst also wrote in to answer the weekly question, and she said this: the smallest thing I think I've ever thanked God for is a seed, probably specifically a poppy seed, as they are tiny. I love gardening when I have the time, and it always gives me the headspace to spend time listening to God. I especially enjoy sowing seeds in the early spring when it's still cold outside, these tiny seeds that will hopefully bring lots of fruit, flowers, or vegetables in the summer. The potential of each tiny seed amazes me. It is important to see the beauty in small things and not to despise the day of new beginnings. We all go through darkness and experience exile where we feel lost. It's how you come out that's important. Looking to the past, we give a place for grief. Looking to the future, we move forwards to hope, and the present offers us a tension between the two. Back in the forest, I said to my friend, "Come back next year, in May. The flowers will be in bloom again. The seasons will come round again. And whilst it will never be exactly the same, it will have its own glorious beauty." Don't let disappointment with your past, your current circumstances, distract you from your future. God will make a way. A path will become clear. And if we keep looking to him, our great, great potential will be realised. We don't cry at a baby in its undeveloped form. We shout with joy and encourage every time it falls. And we look forward with hope to its yet undeveloped potential. Sue Beach sees the potential in every child she fosters. God is about restoration and rebuilding. Beauty will rise from the ashes, and God will repay what the locusts have eaten. So what were our lessons in leadership and leading a God-centered life from the Kings into Chronicles? We need to follow good leaders who put God first. We need to keep accountable to someone during our journey of faith, and pride comes before a fall. And what did we learn from the people of Israel on their return from exile? Put God first, everything in its right order. Take pleasure in small things, and find value in what God is doing in the present, looking forward with hope to realise our great, great potential in the future. It is easy to focus on our failings and not our potential. But God welcomes us just as we are, in all seasons of life. The Israelites spent 70 years in exile before returning to rebuild the temple. God is patient. He is in no rush. God starts small. Big will come. But in the meantime, we live in the tension of the now, but not yet. And for us, regardless of how many times we fall away, we can restore our relationship with God too. The difference is that we do not have to go into exile because we have been cleansed by the blood of the Lamb, Jesus. Jesus who heals, comforts, rebuilds, and restores. So let's return, reconcile, and rebuild our lives in relationship with God. Let's put God first. Let's see beauty in small things. And let's see the world from a perspective of great, great potential.